Under the pressures of war, many proven aircraft designs underwent a continual process of variation. At a somewhat frantic pace, significant resources were thrown at attempts to outclass enemy aircraft with all sorts of novel design concepts for better speed, maneuverability, and weapon systems. In this race, the Messerschmitt Me 262 was a proven airframe that lent itself to many variations. Some remained on the drawing board, while others pushed the limits of military aircraft design. The Messerschmitt Me 262 is easily recognized. In its early planning stages, researchers proposed 6 variants of the 262, a fighter, or Jaeger, which had 2 derivative variants, the rocket-powered interceptor, which had 3 derivatives, a bomber with 3 derivatives, a reconnaissance aircraft with 3 derivatives, a trainer version, and an anti-tank attack aircraft known as Panzerflugzeug, which had 2 derivatives. Many of these hypothetical designs were never realized as production aircraft. During development, 12 prototypes of the Me 262 were built. Each prototype varied slightly, with different engines and a slightly different designation, initially P1065 and later Me 262, each with a V or variant number behind the designation. The first production model would be designed Me 262A1A and named Schwalbe, or Swallow. Powered by 2 Jumo 004 engines and armed with 4 30mm Mk108 cannons in the nose, A1A was a fighter above all else, yet from it several other variants would emerge. The first was the A1A U1, heavily armed with 2 20mm MG151 cannons, 2 30mm Mk103 cannons, and 2 30mm Mk108 cannons. Only one was ever produced. Then, the A1A U2 was produced. Again, only one was ever made. The U2 was designed as a testbed for an Me 262 night fighter program. It featured a 90 MHz Liechtenstein SN2 radar transceiver and a Hirschgewei antenna array on the nose. Following this, the A1A U3 was produced in small numbers. The U3 was a reconnaissance aircraft which could be fitted with various types of cameras, often the RB2030. These were often unarmed, although some retained a single 30mm nose cannon. The A1A U4 was produced shortly after. This is likely the most recognizable of the Swallow variants. Known as the Pulksastorer, it was designed specifically as a bomber destroyer designed to take down bombers like the B-17. This would be achieved with the use of a 50mm autocannon, which, in theory, would make quick work of heavy bombers. The Rheinmetall BK-5 was used as the 50mm autocannon, but later the Mk214 would also be tested on the aircraft. Along similar lines, the next variant, the A1A U5, also made use of heavier armament. The U5 prototype was armed with 6 Mk108 30mm cannons in the nose, although it is unclear whether it was intended to be a heavily armed fighter or a bomber interceptor. Supposedly, at least one of these U5 variants entered full service during the war. Another odd variant was known to exist. It operated with the Squadron JG-7 and was modified to carry 2 BR-21 air-to-air mortar tubes. This aircraft was likely field-modified and thus had no designation beyond A1A. The final variant of the Swallow was the A1B, distinguished from its earlier variants by a new engine, the BMW 3A, yet only 3 would be produced. Following the success of the A1 Swallow and its sub-variants, a new type of Me 262 would enter the war. This would be designated Me 262A2, known as the Sturmvogel, or Stormbird. This version would go on to become the most widely recognized and most well-remembered version of the Me 262. Designed as a multi-role aircraft with a focus on ground attack, the Stormbird was fitted with 2 bomb racks under the fuselage, designed to carry 2 250-kilogram bombs, although 2 500-kilogram bombs could reportedly be fitted as well. It would also feature 2 cannons, rather than 4 or 6, in order to retain proper balance with the aircraft, which would be more important given its increased payload. From this base model, 2 variants would be produced. The A2AU-1 remained rather the same as the original, but featured an advanced bomb sight to aid with ground attack missions. Only one was built. Then the A2A-U2 was designed. This model was particularly unique, being designed specifically for bombing missions. It featured a redesigned nose which was glazed, allowing a bombardier to sit in the front and line up targets. Not much information exists about its operations. 3 other A-model Me-262s would be designed following this. The first, the A3A, was specifically designed as a ground attack aircraft intended to operate at low levels. However, a working variant was never produced. It would have featured improved armor, more fuel, ammunition, and better intakes. Hard on its heels was the A4A, designed as a high-speed reconnaissance aircraft. It may have operated in a limited capacity, however its primary drawback was a lack of armament. In response, the A5A was developed, which featured 2 30mm Mk108 cannons and drop tanks. This version would see use during the end of the war, with small numbers operating across the front. In order to train pilots on the Me-262, there existed the B1A model. This model was based on the A1A, but featured a larger cockpit to accommodate 2 seats, alongside dual controls and the ability to attach fuel tanks. 15 of these aircraft are known to have been produced. Some of these were converted into the B1A-U1, which took the 2-seat configuration for use as a night fighter. It was equipped with a FUG-218 Neptune radar and an antler antenna array on the nose, alongside 2 Mk108 cannons and 2 MG151s. These aircraft were fast, but encountered problems when the antenna array was found to produce drag. This directly led to the development of the B2A, a model specifically designed for the night fighter role. With a slightly stretched fuselage and larger fuel capacity, the B2A would feature a FUG-240 radar with an internal antenna, reducing the problem with drag. The aircraft would also feature 2 Mk108 cannons behind the cockpit, facing in an upwards configuration to target aircraft above. Supposedly, one such model was produced before the end of the war. The final major model of the Me-262 appeared near the end of the war. This was the C model, proposed specifically as a defensive aircraft for Germany. Several versions would be produced from this model, all with the goal of developing alternative power plants for increased speed. The first was the C1A, which remained fairly similar to the A1A, but featured a rocket engine mounted in the tail to increase speed of takeoff and intercept. One was produced as a test aircraft and is said to have shot down an American P-47 Thunderbolt during a test flight. The C2B followed shortly after. It was converted from an A1A model, then fitted with a mixed-power turbojet, which combined a BMW 3A turbojet with a BMW 109-718 rocket. The outcome of this interesting design is uncertain. Then came the C3 variant, which existed in 2 forms. The first, simply known as the C3, was to be powered by 2 Walter HWKR2 211 rocket engines in place of turbojets, whilst the second form, known as the C3A, was to retain its 2 turbojet engines, but be fitted with a Walter HWK109 509's 2 rocket under the fuselage, which could momentarily increase speed. This latter version was captured in a factory at Jenbach when the Allies arrived in April 1945. Beyond the C model, several other odd variants of the Me-262 were proposed before the end of the war. Some of the standout variants include the W1 and W3, which were to have their turbojets taken out and replaced by pulse jets. The W1 was to feature the Argus AS-14 pulse jet, whilst the W3 would feature the AS-44 pulse jet with large, square intakes. There is uncertainty about how much development went into these proposals. Following the pulse jet ideas, a ramjet version was proposed. This was designated Me-262 Lorin, since it was to have 2 Lorin ramjets placed above the 2 turbojets on the wings, creating a 4-engined aircraft. The operational range of such an aircraft would be decreased by 80%. However, it would have massively increased the speed performance of the aircraft. During this same period, Me-262s were also used for an interesting side project, to research a flying rig known as the Deichselschlepp. This rig was to be used as either a refueling pod or a 1,000-kilogram bomb. The design was simple in theory. The rig was winged to allow for flight and was attached to the tow aircraft using a hollow beam with articulating points. To take off, a 2-wheeled dolly was placed under the rig. As the aircraft sped up, the rig would take flight. 2 explosive bolts would cause the dolly to separate from the rig and flight would be achieved. When used as a bomb, the pilot could aim using the standard REVI gun sight. Entering a shallow dive, another explosive bolt would cause the bomb to release and glide to its target. When put to the test, success varied. The test pilot, Gerd Lindner, had success when using a 500-kilogram variant of the bomb, but when a 1,000-kilogram version was tested, it was found to oscillate violently. In one case, he had to eject, and in another, he had to land with the bomb still attached. However, Lindner believed that with more time and testing, the project would have been a success. Another strange test took place sometime during the development of the Me-1101 jet program. According to what information is available, an Me-262 was fitted with a long engine intake on one of its wings. This intake was supposedly part of a research project aimed at developing the engine for the P-1101 program. Before the end of the war, another project was undertaken known as Mistel. This saw large drone craft, either powered or unpowered, attached to a piloted aircraft. These drones were unguided and were packed full of explosives. Roughly 250 aircraft were tested in this configuration, including several Me-262s. The final variants of the Me-262 were actually produced after the end of the war. The Czech aircraft manufacturing company Aviation had leftover components from German aircraft and sought to develop these for use in their own air force. The Me-262 was designed into 3 versions by the Czechs, using the locally built Jumo 4 engine known as the Aviation M04. These aircraft were the single-seater S-92, of which 9 were produced, the 2-seat trainer CS-92, of which 3 were produced, and the experimental S-92-7, which was powered by the experimental BMW 3 engines. All of these aircraft were phased out by the 1950s. Thus, the Me-262 had a wider developmental history than most would realize. Although many of its variants were experimental and saw limited combat use, it proved that the platform was more versatile than expected, despite being essentially the first of its kind. These variants and the lessons learnt would lay the groundwork for many future fighters developed after the war.